in the field of neonatology. So this gives us energy to think of having more of academic program, and we believe uh, knowledge is power, and sharing knowledge is something which is very special and very unique. So today we have two speakers. First is Dr. Janaki ma'am, and she doesn't need any introduction because she is a wonderful teacher, a passionate teacher we can call, and because of her teaching and her training and guide, the way she has guided, there are so many big names we are seeing across the country and outside the country as well. So she's going to talk on NRP during COVID, how to go about. So I request today Dr. Sidhu, our Joint Secretary, North NNF Karnataka chapter, will be moderating the session once the discussion part comes. So Dr. Sidhu, Dr. Sidhu. Yeah, so I think he's there. Yeah. All right. Ma'am, over to you, ma'am. Please start the session.
Sure. A very good evening to everybody. At the outset, of course, my thanks to NNF, Dr. Kotresh and team for giving me an opportunity to be here today. And of course, my special thanks to Prashant, because Prashant has given me a topic that I really care about and I'm very passionate about, and that is NRP. So over the next 30 to 40 minutes, we shall discuss what changes we need to make in our neonatal resuscitation program with the background of a COVID suspected or a COVID positive mother. The next one, please. Before we go on to the NRP proper, let's just have a very brief review of the global as well as the Indian perspective of the whole matter. All of us know that the first case was reported on November 19th at Wuhan, China. So in the last 5.5 months, this has been a devastating pandemic.
Just the mic little down, ma'am. It's okay, we can hear you.
Yeah. It's involved more than 210 countries, and the total number of cases today have gone up to 30 lakhs with a mortality of about 2.5 lakh people. Coming to our own scenario, in India, we have more than 37,000 cases as on today and nearly 1,200 deaths. Fortunately, India has been less affected compared to the Western world. And if you really look at the mortality of these, you will see that the most vulnerable population is people above 65 to 70 years, and especially those with comorbidities in the form of diabetes or hypertension. The next one. The next most common or the next most vulnerable population is the mother-baby duo. And this is what we are interested in as pediatricians. So why is this mother-baby duo, why are they so vulnerable? Number one, all of us know that pregnancy itself is an immunodeficient state. And neonates, all of us know, lack immunological strength in the form of cell-mediated as well as the humoral immunity. More so if you look at premature babies and low birth weight babies. They are the most vulnerable population. So we need to make some changes. Medicine is, as all of you know, a very, very dynamic field. We cannot stick to the same old recommendations that we have been using. You may have done an advanced NRP 2 years ago and got a certified NRP, advanced NRP as a certified trainer. But today, we really need to adjust ourselves to these circumstances. We need to say what exactly are the changes that we need to make in terms of our resuscitation. It is said that to improve, we need to change, but I'm sure all of us want to become perfect. So to become perfect, we need to change often. So NRP needs to be twisted and needs to be changed. And all of you, as you know, when we did our NRP or when we go into the neonatal resuscitation room, we are looking at mainly the mother and the baby. First, we look at the mother's file. Does this mother have any comorbidities? What medications has she been on? Has she been steroided? Has she had any infection? Number two, looking at the fetus, we look at the NST, we look at the CTG, whether there is any deceleration, whether there is any meconium stain liquor. So all of us have all the time been concentrating on the mother and the baby. But today, the time has come when we need to look at, or when we need to pay equal emphasis to a third person in this party. So who is this third person? The next one, please. The third person in this scenario is the health worker. The safety of the health worker today needs to be really focused on and needs to be really concentrated on. When we went to the delivery rooms, all that we did was wear a gown, and if we had time, wear a cap, mask, and gloves. Many a time, all of you will agree that we have rushed into the labor room, just worn gloves, and resuscitated the little one. But in the background of a COVID suspected or a COVID positive mother, a lot of preparation needs to go in before we attend this delivery. Because the health worker
creating that because of the thing, it's directly blowing and disturbing them. Just drop the thing. Speak, ma'am.
Okay. So, because the health worker himself or herself,
little louder you speak, ma'am.
Yeah. The
Or
health
just
worker.
keep the mic here down, ma'am, so that it doesn't directly blow the mic.
Okay.
Little
The health worker himself or herself is at greatest risk of contracting this coronavirus infection. And all of you must have heard of a neonatologist whom we recently lost in the UK, because of coronavirus infection. So in addition to the mother and the baby duo, today we are also looking at safety of the health worker. So I shall be explaining to you how this has been achieved. Next one, please. Before I go on to the changes in the NRP recommendation, there is a caveat here. I must tell you that these recommendations are not based on RCTs and they are not peer reviewed. These recommendations have mainly come from personal practice of workers who have studied a lot of these cases in China, US, Spain, and Italy. So most of these recommendations have been taken from papers which have been recently published, say in the last 2 or 3 months. And of course, our own NNF, IAP, and FOXI have done extensive research, and they have also formulated a few recommendations. But what you must remember is that these recommendations are not, they hold good as on today. They are very, very likely to have amendments as we learn more about the coronavirus, more about the pathology, more about the pathophysiology, etc. So these are not peer reviewed and these are not RCTs. These are recommendations in the light of experiences in these countries that have suffered the maximum hit due to coronavirus infection. The next one, Prashant. There are certain gray zones which we need to address before we look at the neonatal resuscitation. Number one, how does the baby get this coronavirus infection? Is it an intrauterine transmission? That means, is it a vertically transmitted disease? In this context, I must quote to you a study that was done in Wuhan. Wuhan, as you all know, is the epicenter of coronavirus infection. Chen et al. In Wuhan Medical Center have studied 9 pregnant women who delivered babies. They have done biopsies of the cord, they have studied the cord blood, the placenta, the amniotic fluid. All these were found to be negative. So the chances of a vertical transmission are rather remote as of now. And they have even done RT-PCRs of the cord blood as well as the amniotic fluid, and everything was found to be negative. But however, there are certain other workers like Fan et al., again from China, who have demonstrated that there are IgM positive antibodies in the neonate within the first week of life. So this probably raises a little doubt. So there could be a small chance that vertical transmission is possible. And the other great accident that can happen is an antepartum hemorrhage or a maternal-fetal transfusion. In these situations also, these are rare situations, they result probably in vertical transmission. So by and large, vertical transmission is rather unlikely at the moment. So does a mother with coronavirus infection, does she tend to deliver prematurely? This is an excellent study that was conducted in New York. They studied 32 pregnant women with corona positivity who delivered. And you will be astonished to see that 15 out of these 32 babies were born premature. Why is this prematurity? Spain again said that this prematurity was not due to the coronavirus infection. It was more due to maternal indications. The obstetricians chose to deliver the woman mainly because she was in impending respiratory failure or she was in shock because of this severe COVID infection. So here the prematurity was more due to maternal indication rather than prematurity being due to the COVID infection per se. The other important question that we need to ask ourselves is, do these pregnant women who go into preterm labor, should we give them steroids? Steroids, as you all know, are immunosuppressants. So do they really hinder the baby developing any kind of resistance? Do they cause more immunosuppression in the neonate? This has been extensively studied, and people have now said that the advantages of steroids far outweigh this theoretical risk of immunosuppression. So definitely steroids have to be given to women who are likely to deliver prematurely. The same holds good for magnesium sulfate. Magnesium sulfate, all of us know, is a very good neuroprotector. So magnesium sulfate also is administered as per protocol. There is absolutely no contraindication. So before we go to the delivery, all of us have been taught in NRP that there are three things that you must look at. Number one, you look at the personnel. Number two, you look at the place. Number three, you look at equipments. So let us say there is a woman who has walked in. She is pregnant and she's in labor. The most important thing, and this lady has come with fever, cough, and respiratory distress. So as usual, we always take a very detailed history. Here, what is the relevant history? You take history of contact. Has she been in contact with a person who was COVID positive? Number two, has she been traveling? Of course, these days, international travel has been rolled out because of the lockdown. We look at travel from hotspots, where there have been a lot of cases that have been registered, and we look at her symptoms. And the current dictum is that if any woman in labor presents with fever, cough, and respiratory distress, it is deemed as coronavirus positive unless proved negative by RT-PCR. So you get a lady like this in labor and who has high fever and cough. The first thing that you need to do is please give her an N95 mask. This is because of source containment. We do not want her splashing the viruses all over the place. The first thing that you need to give her is an N95 mask, and all health personnel who will be talking to her, who will be dealing with her, will wear personal protective equipment. The most important thing, of course, I said, you have to assume that it is corona. So please obtain swabs from this mother. You need to get nasopharyngeal swabs as well as oropharyngeal swabs. We do not do rectal swabs in adults. It's been tried only in the adults, only in neonates. So of the two, it is said that the nasopharyngeal swabs have much more positivity compared to oropharyngeal swab. What is very important is when you take an oropharyngeal swab, please see that you do not touch the teeth or the gums. The oropharyngeal swab must be taken around the peritonsillar area. That is very, very important. And immediately it is sent for RT-PCR. RT-PCR is by far the gold standard for diagnosis of coronavirus infection. The sensitivity and specificity of RT-PCR is more than 90%. The earliest that you can get a result in about 6 to 8 hours, all depends on the load. There are some hospitals that may take 24 to 48 hours, but the earliest you can get it is by about 6 to 8 hours. Now, so we have sent off the RT-PCR. So now what do we do? The other thing we need to do is the person who's the support person who's accompanying the mother, could be the husband, could be her friend, or could be her mother. If they wish to be with this patient, you have to do a screening for this support person as well. So you need to take an RT-PCR of the husband as well before you get them into the delivery room. Now, this lady, let us say, is going to deliver a 30-week preterm baby. So all of us know that prenatal counseling is very, very important. And generally, how do we do this prenatal counseling? We sit across the table, we discuss with the husband, the family members, as to the outcome of this baby. So if this baby is premature or this baby is a very high risk, what are the chances of his survival? What is the probable duration of stay in the NICU? All these morbidities and the outcomes have to be explained in detail. Normally, we do this sitting across a table. Here, we do not do that. This prenatal counseling will be telephonic only. This is mainly to reduce the risk of exposure to the health workers. So video counseling or telephonic counseling is very, very important in the face of a coronavirus infection. And as I said, the mother is transferred with an N95 mask to the delivery room. Many hospitals will allow the husband or a support person with the mother to the labor room. Only if the support person also has had an RT-PCR and found to be negative, we can allow this support person. Otherwise, the support person is not allowed into the DR. The mother can probably stay in touch by video with the support person. The other important thing is personnel. Normally, when we have a high-risk delivery, at least 2 or 3 persons of the pediatric team will go into the delivery room. The fellow goes in, the senior nurse goes in, and the consultant goes in. Here, there is a singular exception. It is recommended that minimal staff, both the obstetric as well as the neonatal staff, the minimal staff will go into the labor room. This is again to minimize exposure. But however, the support staff will be probably waiting just outside in case further help is required. So in terms of personnel, please remember minimal obstetric and neonatal staff will go in. So this is the labor room. Coming to the place, we have finished the personnel. Now let's come to the place. It's very, very important that we deliver these ladies in special labor rooms where other deliveries do not take place. So in the face of a pandemic, if we are taking in outborn women who just come unbooked or women who just come in advanced labor, it's very, very important that you have a dedicated labor room for such patients. Such patients cannot be cared for in regular labor rooms where other non-infected persons are going to deliver. Number 2, in Western world, they use what is called negative pressure rooms, delivery rooms. We may not have that luxury, but we can definitely have a sort of a makeshift by having 3 or 4 exhaust fans. So these exhaust fans will probably help to disseminate certain viruses and bacteria of the labor room. So as you can see, there are only 2 people standing there. One is the midwife or the senior nurse, and the other one is an obstetrician. So where will you place the infant warmer and where will the pediatrician stay? There are 2 options. One option, on the best option, is that the neonatal person stays in the next room with a warmer come isolate. That means a warmer which can be converted into an incubator, for example, a giraffe. So we need to have equipment like that because we use it as a warmer during resuscitation. And when we shift the baby to the NICU, it is converted into an isolate, again, to minimize risk of transmission of the virus. But however, this luxury may not be there in all hospitals. We can't afford the luxury of having different rooms for the pediatrician, different rooms for the delivery room, etc. So if such is the case, you can have the warmer 6 feet away from the labor cot. And preferable always to have a curtain in between the mother and the neonate. Needless to say that all these things must be sterilized before the delivery of the baby. So dedicated labor room, minimal OB staff, minimal pediatric staff, and preferably the baby 6 feet away from the mother, or the best option is the baby to be resuscitated in the next room. This is regarding the labor room. The next one, please. Now, what is the mode of delivery going to be? Is it vaginal or is it cesarean? This, of course, is left to the best decisions of the obstetricians. But what we must remember is that if this lady is delivered by cesarean section, there are invariably going to be more number of health workers. So increased exposure to health workers is a problem. And if it's a cesarean delivery, is it going to be a general anesthesia or a spinal anesthesia? Please note, GA carries with it tremendous risks because you are going to intubate this lady. And intubation means droplet, increased risk of droplet generation. So there is more risk of transmission of infection to the healthcare worker. So if possible, always do a spinal anesthesia. I'm telling you all these things because these are all the procedures that cause increased droplet dissemination and increased risk of infection to the health workers. And now coming to the health worker, we have finished the place. Now we come to the health worker. The most important thing is anybody attending delivery of a COVID suspected or a COVID positive woman must wear what is called a personal protection equipment. A full PPE is an absolute must. In addition to the PPE, if you expect a preterm delivery and if you expect the baby is going to receive CPAP, etc., there is another important device called the powdered aerosol. There's a PAPR, a powdered aerosol equipment, which I shall be showing you shortly. The next one, please, Prashant. The next one, please. Coming to parts of the personal protection equipment, there are two types of surgical masks that are used. This is the common surgical mask that all of us use. This, please remember, is a triple layer mask. The middle layer is the one that acts as a filter. This ordinary surgical mask, what are the drawbacks of this? The ordinary surgical mask at the most protects you from a splash of body fluids. For example, it could be amniotic fluid, it could be blood. It protects you from a splash, but however, it does not protect you from small particles like bacteria or viruses. The other drawback of the surgical mask is it's very, very loose at the sides. So there is a lot of seepage or escape of air from the sides. The only other thing that it does is it protects others from mucus and saliva of the wearer. So a surgical mask is recommended only for the lay public, whereas a frontline worker should be using something better, and that is the N95 mask. This is the N95 mask. This is a very, very important. This is much superior to the surgical mask. How is it superior? This N95 mask has a special filter that filters out 95% of organisms which are as small as 0.3 microns. The other great advantage of this N95 is that this N95 very snugly fits onto the face, so the leak on the sides is minimal. But what is very important is, you've all read in the papers about low quality personal protective equipment being supplied by a country. You should always see to it that this N95 mask is NIOSH certified. NIOSH is an international agency that is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. This is the NIOSH, which is an international agency, and only NIOSH certified N95 masks must be used. Because N95 masks, a lot of substandard masks are being made, and these should be absolutely abandoned. Next, we come to the PPE suit. If you can expand it, Prashant. Can we make it bigger, this image?
Not possible, ma'am.
Not possible? Okay. This PPE, as you can make out, has several parts. Number one is, you already have a scrub suit. You wear this impermeable gown on top of that. This impermeable gown, again, must be checked before you wear it, because this impermeable gown is what is called 25 to 50 GSM. That means the thickness of this gown should be 25 to 50 grams per square meter. These are all specifications that are very, very important, and all the hospital administrators need to look at these specifications. So if you just, how do you check this gown? If you just splash a little water on this gown, the water should just flow over the gown. It should not soak the underlying clothes. So it's a totally impermeable one. This covers the person, the entire torso of the person, including the head. It extends to just below the knees. And below the knees, of course, you have the shoe cover, and it extends all over the arm. The second and most important thing is, along with this, you wear an N95 mask. You also wear a face shield. And the last thing is, you wear a glove. Gloves are again of two types, the common latex gloves and the nitrile gloves, which I shall tell you about. So please make sure that the PPE is of good standard and does not cause permeation of fluid into the scrub suit. The next one, please. This is the PAPR I was telling you. This is the powdered air purifying respirator. For example, if you have a baby who is going to require CPAP, you do not want the aerosols to infect you. So this is a sort of a battery operated. You can see the battery at the back of this person. It's a battery operated device which blows air onto the person's face. So if you're wearing a PAPR, you don't have to wear an N95 mask, because this PAPR has a HEPA filter The HEPA filter is a very superior kind of a filter that filters very, very small particulate matter. So this is, of course, much more expensive, and not many hospitals are able to use this. But this is, again, one of the armamentarium in the PPE kit. The next one. I just want to share a very short, a very small experience that we had in our own unit. This is Dr. Naresh, our junior consultant, with a full PPE. So what happened was 3 weeks ago, we had a lady who was previously booked with us, but who unfortunately had gone to her mother's house. This was a hot spot from where she came. She traveled all the way 100 kilometers to reach our hospital. And when she came, she was in advanced labor. She came with high fever, she came with cough, she came with breathlessness. So everybody was very panicky. Our obstetrics department was very well prepared because they do take unbooked deliveries. And we had a separate isolation labor room made only for this purpose. And this lady's RT-PCR was taken immediately. Our own research lab conducts RT-PCR tests, and we were able to get the reports in about 6 to 8 hours. But before we got the report, this lady had already delivered. The baby came out very well, did not require any resuscitation. Baby seemed totally asymptomatic. But after 24 hours, I think at about 36, 38 hours, this baby started having high fever and respiratory distress. So till then, the baby was kept with the attendant, isolated in a room. But once the baby got symptomatic, baby was shifted to an isolation room in the NICU. And Naresh had to don this PPE, and he took out the nasopharyngeal as well as the oropharyngeal swabs. Luckily for us, both mother and baby were found to be RT-PCR negative. The baby improved with antibiotics, so it was a bacterial congenital pneumonia, and both were discharged in good shape. What I want to tell you about the PPE is, this is the nitrile gloves that I was talking to you about, the blue gloves. This nitrile gloves is again a very, very important part of the armamentarium because these are nothing but latex gloves. So these latex gloves again are very, very thick and they are impermeable. So this again is a very important protection for the wearer. This PPE kit should be called a very painful personal protection equipment because this is very, very uncomfortable as far as the wearer is concerned. It's impossible to go for 6 hours, 8 hours with this PPE because one starts profusely sweating. You're not allowed to touch your face. You're not allowed a drink of water. You can't even go to the restroom. In fact, in the West, when people have been forced to do long shifts, there are reports that they wore adult diapers because they could not visit the loo. So this is the great amount of personal trouble that our health workers go into. And I only wish our general public will realize this great amount of personal discomfort and of course the mental anguish that our frontline workers face when they're handling a lady with a COVID positivity. So this is regarding the personal protection equipment. Very important that we check the standard of this equipment. Now, you just cannot wear the personal protection equipment wherever you like. There should be, again, 2 separate rooms. One room is called the donning area. That is where donning means where you put on the PPE. The other one is called the doffing area. That means after your job is over, you need to remove the PPE only in this particular area because you are removing highly contaminated material. So it cannot be done in the patient's room. It cannot be done in the corridor or anywhere that you like. And what I would like to emphasize is when you don, that means when you put on your personal protection equipment, first you do hand hygiene, then put on the gown, the mask, goggles, face shield, lastly you put on the glove. But when you're doffing, that means when you're removing your PPE, the gloves always come off first because that is the most contaminated part. The gloves always come off first, then the goggles, the eye shield, as well as the gown. Please remember, you should never remove the mask in the patient's room. Mask is always removed outside the patient area because again, that is a very highly contaminated. So you can probably see all these procedures on YouTube. I will not go much into detail, except to tell you that the gloves go on last when you don, but the gloves come off first when you doff. This is a very important principle of putting on the PPE and removal of the PPE. So as we have already said, the delivery room is a dedicated delivery room only for COVID patients. Negative pressure, we have already said, which you can manage with 3 to 4 exhaust fans. The baby resuscitator or the warmer to be 6 feet away and with a curtain separated. The ideal thing, of course, would be to have an adjacent room. The next one, please. From now on, what I must tell you is these recommendations are mainly based on the facility. That means it depends on what kind of hospital you are working in. If it's a very high pressure hospital, for example, my alma mater, Vanivilas Hospital, it's a very, very high, large patient load. So there you may have to do things a little differently. Whereas if you work in private hospitals, which may afford to have a lot of space, you have to do things a little different. So these recommendations are largely facility based and also depends, of course, on the caseload. The next one, please. So now the baby is delivered. Let us say the baby is delivered vaginally and the baby has a little bit of secretions. What are the things you must be very, very careful about during your resuscitation? Please avoid deep suction as much as possible, because suction is one thing that disseminates a large number of droplets and can cause health hazard to the resuscitator. So avoid deep suction. That is very, very important. Even in our NRP, we say that avoid routine suction. That is always there. Here, please avoid deep suction. That's very important. And of course, if the lady had a meconium staining and the baby is vigorous, definitely we don't do any kind of intubation. If your baby is apneic, you have no choice but to start positive pressure ventilation in this baby. So what kind of positive pressure ventilation are you going to do? Is it going to be a bag and mask ventilation, or is it going to be a T-piece ventilation? Bag and mask ventilation, especially in very small preterm babies, can cause a lot of leak around the mask. So some workers do recommend the use of laryngeal mask airway, especially in babies around 2 kilos. That can be done. So it's a matter of individual preference, whether you do a T-piece resuscitator or whether you do a bag and mask ventilation. But one very important thing that you need to remember is avoid open suctioning of the ET tube. Again, intubation is a very hazardous procedure in these patients. When you are intubating, please be very careful to turn your face as soon as you have intubated, to turn your face away and immediately to connect the bag, because when you have intubated, a large number of droplets get disseminated through the ET tube. And avoid open suctioning of the ET tube in the labor room. So how do we make our positive pressure devices more safe? You can see in this picture that there is a HEPA filter that is attached to the positive pressure devices. This HEPA filter, it's a very high efficiency filter which filters out bacteria and viruses. So this is attached to the patient inlet, and these are a few modifications that have been done in order to prevent dissemination of bugs. So use of a HEPA filter has been recommended. The next one, please. Now, the baby is stabilized. What would you like to do? Do you want to do an immediate cord clamping, or should you go with a delayed cord clamping? This is $1 million question. The Chinese, again, the workers, the Chinese, Americans, and the Spanish differ a lot in their views. Some of them who have really borne the brunt of this disease, like the Americans and the Chinese, are all for early clamping of the cord. Please get the baby away from the mom as quickly as possible. That is what they say. But let us really look at it. The delayed cord clamping can be done if a health worker just holds the baby at the level of the introitus. The baby doesn't have to be on the mother's abdomen. The baby can be held by a health worker, and we just wait for 1 minute to give delayed cord clamping. This has also been endorsed by our WHO as well as our IAP and NNF. If you really look at the logic behind it, this baby was within the mother's womb for the last 9 months. If he did not have transmission in the last 9 months, will he have transmission just because you're going to delay the cord clamping by 1 minute? On the other hand, DCC, has a lot of other advantages. So definitely in a developing country, I think we should go for DCC. The only thing I would say is that while doing a DCC, it is the health worker who must hold the baby at the level of the introitus and not place the baby on the mom's abdomen. Because if you place the baby on the mom's abdomen, again, the chances of droplet infection are going to be tremendous. And if the parents are highly educated and they are understanding what procedures need to be done, these kind of controversies may be discussed with the parents. The next one. So do we give kangaroo mother care to this neonate? I do not think so. Kangaroo mother care definitely has not been advocated, because when you do KMC, the mother and baby are in very, very close proximity, and chances of infection are very high. So KMC is ruled out, but DCC can definitely be done. So let me just tell you which are the practices that are very strongly recommended. Practices that are very strongly recommended. The previous slide, please, Prashant. Full PPE. So who should wear the full PPE? The entire attending staff, the obstetric staff, the neonatal staff, everybody must wear a full PPE. The mother should have an N95 mask. We should have a separate delivery room. We should have HEPA filters, especially for our positive pressure devices. We need to keep a warmer, come isolate in the form of a giraffe or something else, so that when we are transferring this baby, we can close it so that we avoid dissemination. And delayed cord clamping has been definitely recommended, but of course, kangaroo mother care is not a good idea. The next one, practices that we need to avoid. This is very, very important for the health worker. Please preferably avoid deep suctioning. Number 2, if at all you have to intubate with a plastic bag around the ET tube, and try to turn your face away as soon as you have completed intubation. Open ET suctioning must be avoided. And if you come to the stage of medication, please remember, do not give ET adrenaline, because when you give ET adrenaline, you're disconnecting the positive pressure device from the ET tube, again leading to aerosol dissemination. If at all you'll have to give medication, make it IV adrenaline. There is no role for ET adrenaline. So these are practices that must be totally avoided if possible. So now we have stabilized the baby. How do we shift the baby to the NICU? Let us say the baby is sick and the baby needs to be shifted to the NICU. Please preferably shift the baby in a closed incubator or in an isolate. And at 24 hours and 48 hours, this baby, of course, goes into an isolation room. There is no doubt about it. There should be a single dedicated nurse in full PPE who will look after this neonate. So you may have to spend on a number of, the administration has to spend on a lot of PPEs, because 6-hour shifts, it takes about 4 nurses and at least 1 doctor. So about 5 to 6 PPEs must be spent per 24 hours, which is quite a costly affair. You will send nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal swabs on this neonate at 24 hours and 48 hours. Strict isolation, dedicated staff, all in full PPE is a must. Now, what are you going to feed this baby? This is very important. Do we give the baby breast milk? Do we give the baby donor milk? Again, this is dependent on the facility. If the mother is, and also depends on the level of sickness of the mother. Supposing the mother is very sick, she herself is transferred to a high intensity unit, she herself is on oxygen, or she's requiring some form of ventilation, it would be impossible for the baby to breastfeed. It has been conclusively proved that expressed breast milk does not contain these viruses. So giving expressed breast milk may still be a very good idea, but the logistics seem a little difficult. Here is this mother isolated in a COVID ward, well away from the NICU. So who is going to get into the COVID ward? To get into the COVID ward, you need a PPE. To get out, again, you need to doff. So all these logistic problems are there. So if the mother is very sick and she's well away from the NICU, it would be a good idea to give donor milk. So as I said, it's all based on the facility and situation based. Depends on how sick the mother is. Supposing we have a high density hospital, like a public hospital, you have a mother who's only mildly symptomatic. Then it might be a good idea to leave the baby with the mother. The mother performs good hand hygiene. She washes her breast. And the other thing is she wears a mask and she can definitely breastfeed if the mother is mildly symptomatic and the baby seems okay. But if the mother is sick, it's always good to give either EBM or a donor milk. This is the chart that tells you the three modes of management. The first mode of management is where you don't want to absolutely take any risk at all. So totally separate the mother from the baby, have them in two different places till both of them get totally cured. The third option is when you are working in a very busy facility, then you will explain to the parents that there is a probable risk of the baby contracting the disease, and you will leave the baby with the mother and encourage breastfeeding. So there is a wide variability in management depending on the facility that you are with. So this is in short the management of a baby who is born to a COVID suspected or a COVID diagnosed baby. So thank you very much for a patient hearing. If there are any questions, I'll try and answer them. Thank you, Prashant.
Ma'am, thank you very much. Questions will take later. We will move on to the next thing, ma'am. I request Chandrakala ma'am to start sharing the slides. So we'll take up question and discussion together later. I'd like to introduce Chandrakala ma'am. She also doesn't need much of introduction.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're very audible, ma'am.
Okay, fine.
So, ma'am is one of the doctors or professor teacher who has been greatly involved in neonatal resuscitation program. And whenever there is NRP, we always first face and name which pops up is Chandrakala ma'am. And she has done many NRP courses. She has trained many people across the country. And she's very experienced, and she's the professor and head of the department of prestigious St. John's Medical College Hospital. Ma'am, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Prashant. At the outset, I want to thank Dr. Kotturesh and his team for giving me such a wonderful opportunity. Am I audible? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's audible. A little louder you speak, ma'am. Little more louder.
Okay. So let us discuss, let's directly go to the topic, the delayed cord clamp and methods, resuscitation with umbilical cord milking or intact cord in asphyxia. So the objectives, what I'm covering today is the physiology of placental transfusion, definitions of delayed cord clamp and intact cord clamp, umbilical cord milking, different types of different methods to do placental transfusion during asphyxia, and the resuscitation with intact cord, and latest studies regarding umbilical cord clamp and umbilical cord milking. And of course, at the end, the suggestions. So what I'm not covering today is, my discussion is not in the context of COVID positive or suspect babies. With that introduction, I will directly go to the presentation. Years back, WHO has recommended for the prevention and treatment of postpartum hemorrhage, as this was an important cause of maternal mortality. So 3 actions were recommended. So here, out of these 3, the first one, definitely administration of prophylactic uterotonic therapy is going to definitely have impact on the postpartum hemorrhage. But I don't think these two, is as any effect on the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. So now, along with this, we have lot of evidence which says delayed cord clamp improve the neonatal outcomes. So with this context, let us go to the umbilical cord management. So in 2010, there was a recommendation of delayed cord clamp, which is may be beneficial. It may be beneficial for infants and who do not need resuscitation at birth. So in 2015, the latest recommendation says delayed cord clamp longer than 30 seconds is reasonable for both preterm and term babies who do not require resuscitation at birth. And non-vigorous infants who need resuscitation at birth should be immediately clamped. So this is a recommendation because there is no evidence of the safety of delayed cord clamp in those babies. And to add to this, they were against the umbilical cord milking in those babies who are less than 29 weeks ELBW babies because of the rapid changes in the blood volume. So further study was warranted according to their guidelines. So let me go to the physiology. All of us know that as soon as a baby is born, sudden interruption of the placental circulation at birth causes increase in the systemic vascular resistance, which in turn increases the arterial pressure and increases the afterload on the left ventricle.
Ma'am, slide is not moving, ma'am.
Pardon?
The slides are not moving.
No, I'm not moving.
Moving, na? Okay, ma'am. Okay, then fine. Okay.
So at the same time, left side of the heart is deprived of venous return or preload because of the increase in the systemic vascular resistance. At the same time, the pulmonary blood flow remains slow. This causes reduction in the blood flow to different organs, especially for brains. That is why it is important that first breath, which triggers a steady transition to autonomous circulation. That is why it is important to have a spontaneous ventilation before the cord is clamped. So we all know placental transfusion at delivery, blood moves from the placenta to the baby, and if the cord is clamped immediately, there will be about 80 to 100 ml of blood is retained in the placenta. That is about 30% of the blood volume. So, of course, there are so many factors which depends the placental transfusion, which I have written here, that I will not go to the detail of this. This slide shows association between the infant blood volume and the placental residual volume at various times of cord clamping.
Slides are not moving, ma'am.
Slides are not moving.
Yeah. Can you stop share and start share again, ma'am?
1 second. Stop share and
start sharing.
1 second. I will do.
Yeah.
Is it
now
fine?
it's visible. Yes.
It's not moving, I think.
You can go with the arrows over there. The in the laptop.
No, it's not moving. 1 second. Let me check. Is that fine? It's not moving.
Yeah. We can. Yeah. Now it's moving.
Fine. Okay. So this slide shows the association between infant blood volume retained in the placenta and at various periods of cord clamping. So here, as we delay the cord clamp, the x-axis is the seconds of cord clamping, and here the volume of blood retained in the baby and in the placenta. As we delay the cord clamp, there is gradually increase in the blood volume in the infant, and there is decrease in the blood volume in the placenta. This is very important to know. So coming to the delayed cord clamp definitions. So what do you mean by delayed cord clamp? Delaying the umbilical cord clamping until after breathing. Delaying the umbilical cord clamping until after breathing is very important. It is to maintain the cardiac output throughout the delivery at birth. Early cord clamping is delaying the clamping and cutting the umbilical cord within 30 seconds. And delayed cord clamping is clamping and cutting after 30 seconds. Although there are so many studies which vary from 30 seconds to 3 or 5 minutes as well. We all know delayed cord clamp is an inexpensive method which allows physiological placental transfusion. What do you mean by physiological based cord clamping? Here, the umbilical cord is clamped and cut when the baby is stable and has spontaneous breathing. This prevents a rapid increase in the blood pressure and sustains heart rate and cardiac output, which is important. So this is where we clamp and cut the cord. So between the two arrows, this is where the one clamp here, another clamp here, and in between this we clamp and cut. So immediate cord clamp, what are the evidence for it? We all know when there is immediate cord clamp, there is significant volume of blood left in the placenta, so which compromise neonatal transition and definitely reduces the cardiac output, which lowers cerebral blood flow and cause tissue hypoxia. And of course, the organ damage. Also, it causes bradycardia, increased pulmonary artery pressure, and surge in the carotid artery pressure, which increase the mortality. What happens with immediate cord clamp with hypoxia? So, immediate cord clamp with hypoxia, it lowers the heart rates and oxygen saturation, required more oxygen and ventilation within first 5 minutes of life. So this is self-explanatory, the advantages of delayed cord clamp. So, but the extra blood transfused from placenta to the newborn. So when that happens, there is improvement in the neurobehavior in infant and children. There is increase in the placenta, the increase in the cerebral perfusion and oxygenation, reduce intraventricular hemorrhage, and decrease the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis. When this extra blood goes to the baby from the placenta, there is increase in the hemoglobin levels. It improves the iron storage, reduce the number of transfusions, reduce the rate of sepsis, and of course there is an increase in the jaundice and requiring phototherapy, but it is not significant. Also, it will allow for the blood storage for the stem cells. On the heart, it improves the hemodynamics, thereby improves the blood pressure. On the lungs, it definitely improves breathing and occurs scores and reduction in the incidence of chronic lung disease. Of course, in all these studies which varied cord clamp, that is delayed from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. So let us look at the effect of the DCC, delayed cord clamp, on hemoglobin levels at term. We have already discussed. We know it is safe, it is effective and reduces anemia, and it is very important for our developing countries. So this is a forest plot which shows the meta-analysis of the effect of delayed cord clamp versus early cord clamp and the risk of intraventricular hemorrhage of any grade by 19 trials arranged in order of publication. It is better. It doesn't cross the line of 1. So it is better. It improves all grades of intraventricular hemorrhage. And 19 trials which compares the same delayed versus immediate cord clamp on the mortality. It is definitely less in delayed cord clamp group. So we all know delayed cord clamp is very important, and this is the latest 2019 Cochrane meta-analysis, which included 48 studies and involving 5,721 mothers. The gestation varied from 24 to 36 weeks of gestation, and delaying of cord clamp from 30 to 60 seconds, and of course range is up to 180 seconds. So this shows that there is definite reduction in the neonatal mortality. And this is the overall effect size of the different studies. And of course, IVH of all grades is less with delayed cord clamp. So according to 2019 study, we know that the delayed cord clamp versus ICC decreases mortality. And here I've quoted the confidence interval. You can look into it. It doesn't cross 1, so it is good. And which included 20 studies and these many babies. Delayed cord clamp, little or no difference in babies with a severe IVH, 3 to 4 IVH, but slightly reduction in any grade IVH with delayed cord clamp as of now. And it has little or no effect on chronic lung disease. And of course, it is very difficult to comment on periventricular leukomalacia because the data was not sufficient. So we all have convinced that the delayed cord clamp is important we need to do for those babies who cry at birth, right? So now, yes, for what is about if the baby needs resuscitation at birth, and whether we should undergo immediate, whether we should do immediate or delayed cord clamp. Is delayed cord clamp is not possible? If it is not possible, what's next? Can we do resuscitation while the cord is intact? And what are the benefits of umbilical cord milking? Benefits of it. So this picture shows the negative consequences of immediate cord clamp, or this is early cord clamp in asphyxia. Okay, so when we do early cord clamping with asphyxia, we know that in asphyxia, there is a need for resuscitation, and which cause increased ischemia reperfusion injury. We know that. And of course, that cause that increase in the risk of PPHN and hypoxic ischemic HIE and hypoxic respiratory failure as well. And of course, this immediate cord clamp, which reduces the left ventricular preload because there is less blood going to the left atrium, and cerebral, which cause cerebral hypoperfusion and HIE, which contributes to the already existing hypoxia. Also, we know that those babies who has asphyxia will have hypovolemia as well. They have hypovolemia as well. That hypovolemia can, also contribute to cerebral hypoperfusion and HIE. Okay, so if the cord is clamped early, approximately 30% of the fetal-placental blood volume is discarded into the placenta, which cause decrease in the RBC volume and oxygen carrying capacity, which cause decrease in the risk of PPH and hypoxic respiratory failure. And we know that early cord clamp also cause increase in the oxidative stress, which again contributes to increased risk of PPHN. So what happens? So cord management in infants who need resuscitation. So we know that neonates who need resuscitation may benefit from placental transfusion. So when any baby has intrauterine asphyxia, for example, when they have tight nuchal cord or they have shoulder dystocia, when they are delivering in the birth canal, there will be pressure on the umbilical cord. So that squeezes the umbilical cord at the birth canal. So what happens is, in umbilical cord there are two arteries and one vein. The vein, which is thin-walled and low pressure, collapses first. When that happens, the blood from the placenta to the baby reduces, but there is continued umbilical flow through the umbilical artery, that is from the baby to the placenta, it continues. So the net transfer of blood volume from the fetus to the placenta happens when the baby has asphyxia or hypoxia. So this is a picture which shows this is what normally happens, that from the placenta it goes to the baby normally in a term baby. And here, if there is any hypoxia, because I told you already, the umbilical vein, that through the umbilical vein the blood flow stops and continues through the blood thick-walled umbilical artery, and that reduces the blood. So this placenta will have more blood volume at the cost of baby. Baby looks paler and the placenta is looking red, right? So at the same time, so this is the graphical representation of umbilical arterial flow, which continues. Look here. And here in the umbilical vein, and at the compression of the umbilical vein, it reduces the blood flow to the umbilical vessel. During compression, it reduces drastically, right? So what is the net flow? So that is from the baby, it goes to the placenta. So this causes hypovolemia. So it is important to establish ventilation while the cord is intact. So what happens when the ventilation is there, when the baby breathes before cord clamp, which maintains the cardiac output during the transition. It increases the pulmonary blood flow and it replaces umbilical venous return. But when the cord clamp happens before the baby has ventilation or before he has his spontaneous breathing or ventilation, there is rapidly increase in the arterial pressure, which reduces the blood return to the left heart and decreases cardiac output and the consequences of this. So what is the advantage of delayed cord clamp in asphyxia? Of course, we studied that the baby will have, when the placental transfusion is there during asphyxia or during resuscitation, of course, we know it replaces the placental transfusion or the left atrial blood volume. Okay, so increase in oxygen, advantages of DCC in asphyxia, of course, this is also important, and increases oxygen carrying capacity of blood, increases antioxidant capacity, and reduces inflammatory effects during delivery. Overall, it is beneficial to the baby. So what about, so we know that now, so maintaining placental transfusion during resuscitation is important in those babies who has asphyxia. We know now. And also we know the importance of delayed cord clamp. So what do we do now? When we want to do the resuscitation, can we do, we can't cut. So we know the importance of placental transfusion now. So can we go ahead doing resuscitation with intact cord? There are several ongoing and completed studies. Those studies which is completed are feasibility studies, and they say it is feasible. But there are a lot of protocol violations there, and including the Australian placental transfusion study. There's a lot of heterogeneity with respect to the population. So these are the studies and which are completed. Look at the time. So it varies from 60 seconds to 3 to 5 minutes, and the clinical outcome has not made any difference while resuscitating the baby when the cord is intact. So there is no difference, but tend to reduce mortality with delayed cord clamping. These are the ongoing trials, and see there are 6 studies still which are ongoing. They look at the primary outcome, all these primary outcomes, IVH, saturation, heart rate, APGAR scores, they have looked at it and they say it is much better. The survey which involved the parents, the neonatologist, or the maternal providers say, what does it say? So parents are very happy because they could see what is going on to the baby, and they could look at the resuscitation and what is the outcome also they are looking. They are very positive. But the neonatal providers, care providers, they thought the cord is too small and they have not able to access to the baby and not able to access to the equipment. This is from the neonatal providers. But if you take both the neonatal providers and the maternal providers, they are happy because there is maintenance of the placental transfusion during resuscitation, which is good for the baby. And the trolley. So what is the, they provided the resuscitation trolley, and they say, some say same or it is better or much better than the conventional equipment. Now, this is one of the new purpose-built resuscitation table, Concord. This mobile resuscitation table, which is possible to, which was, they have looked at it in the feasibility study, and they have noted that it was possible to keep the cord intact after preterm birth till the lung was aerated and the infant was breathing stable and breathing spontaneously, and it was stable. So this was in that study. So there is a new study in 2019 where the intact cord resuscitation versus early cord clamp. And they looked at the outcome during the first 10 minutes of birth. So look at this. So they felt the saturation when the cord was intact at the time of resuscitation, the saturation at 1 minute, the saturation of 5 minutes and 10 minutes was much better. and the heart rate also was better. And also the time to start resuscitation, there was no problem. And also look at here the green ones, what I've underlined here, and the APCA score of less than 5 at 5 minutes was better with the green one. This green one is the intact cord, and this is cord clamped immediately. That was better. Oxygenation less than 85 at 5 minutes was less in intact cord babies, and NICU admission rate was less in those babies. And of course, oxygenation of less than 90 at 10 minutes also was less in those babies who were resuscitated with cord intact. So, improved saturation and higher APCA scores and the absence of negative consequences with doing the resuscitation with cord intact. So, resuscitation with cord intact is useful. We learned it now. Then, what is the problem? The problem is there are many practical issues are there. Violating the sterile field, and if you keep the baby, the delivery or cesarean happens in the AC room. So where the baby is exposed to hypothermia. So maintenance of normothermia is very, very important, and that is violated. And there are lot of logistical issues which needs to be improved before we say that no, this is a standard practice. But this will definitely is useful. It holds a tremendous promise for the resuscitation. So resuscitation with the intact cord is feasible, but we need more research, training, pre-planning, and coordination is very, very important. And delayed cord clamp is a challenge to perform at the mother's bedside. This is very important. With the context of this is better. Okay, so this is a picture, this pathophysiology of asphyxia and hypovolemia. This, I think I explained this, and this is just a pictorial representation. And now what's next? So if it is a practical issue with resuscitating with umbilical cord clamp with the intact cord. So what do we do now? So is there anything for that we do to have a more blood to the baby from the placenta before cutting before clamping and cutting? Yes. So this is umbilical cord milking. So what are the advantages of umbilical cord milking? Let us go to the advantages now first, then we'll go to the methods. So we know umbilical cord milking, we can do it within 20 seconds. And of course, this is much, it takes much less time than immediate cord clamp. And it is noticed that umbilical cord clamp will improve the blood pressure and urine output by increase superior vena cava flow, which reflect the systemic flow and higher right ventricular output. And it causes reduction by maintaining that there will be reduction in the intraventricular hemorrhages and of course necrotizing enterocolitis and death before discharge. So this is an article in 2018 it was published, early versus delayed cord clamp physiological anemia. Of course we know now, and meta-analysis which includes these 7 RCTs, definitely hemoglobin level is improved and decreased risk of oxygen requirement at 36 weeks and decreased IVH of all grades with umbilical cord milking. And also, and ECG wise, there was a longer P-wave PR interval and QTC interval. This may explain why milking may promote earlier onset of breathing compared to delayed cord clamp. So now, what are the difference between umbilical cord clamp versus delayed cord clamp? Is there any difference? Both have advantages, but is there any difference between these two? Umbilical cord clamp as versus delayed cord clamp, definitely there is improvement in the hemoglobin level at birth, which improves hemodynamics, and as already I have mentioned, it improves the blood volume, cardiac output, so improvement in the urine output. There are some concerns with umbilical cord milking. What is the concern? The concern raised was the umbilical cord milking caused sudden raise in the venous pressure. But these concerns were answered in one of the correspondence, and they say no greater increase in the venous pressure as you see in uterine contractions or as you see with the cry, vigorous cry of the newborn baby at birth. So this is definitely umbilical cord milking is the pressure it generates is much below this. So the placental blood is directed towards the lungs during the rapid fall in the pulmonary resistance, unlike any other period when the volume is even. So it is not a sudden increase in the pressure in the lungs as well. But there is a small concern that it may cause hyperbilirubinemia, and none of the studies have said this is is a major concern. It did not require any chain transfusion. So conclusions of cord milking: yes, it is good. No adverse effect of milking was noticed, and it has a higher and similar cognitive and language scores with umbilical cord milking compared to delayed cord clamping at birth. This is one of the advantage over delayed cord clamp. But what happens in ELBW babies? So in ELBW babies, there is a recent animal data in preterm land shows there is rapid swings in the carotid pressure and the flow, and the trials are of very small size. And those small babies who has highly vascular germinal matrix are prone to bleed because of the swings in the pressures. So still the exact physiological impact of umbilical cord milking is not sufficient, is not clear. So because of this, in 2015, ILCOR guidelines said that umbilical cord milking was associated with some benefit, but there is no adverse effects. At the same time, it is possible umbilical cord milking is more beneficial for smaller and more immature neonates. But in the short-term outcome, they are okay, but still they are not okay with the long-term outcome of these babies. So still is a query. This was introduced in 2015 recommendation. And after this, even after 2015, there are more studies, 2018 and 19. So they said that they have done a survey of obstetricians and neonatologists in the US, and where in the survey, 38.9% of obstetrical providers are doing umbilical cord milking. And they also said that there are 2 trials in India, which is just completed and demonstrate that it is feasible study in term and preterm infants who are depressed at birth. And one of the study is our own study from St. John's by Ram Mohan, our DM student in 2018. It was published in Resuscitation, and that quoted this study. And also there are 2 more national multi-city studies are there. I'm not sure whether this is completed. So what is that umbilical cord milking? How do we do it? There are 2 methods. One is intact cord milking. The other one is cut umbilical cord milking. In cut umbilical cord milking, you clamp and cut the cord of 25 centimeters. The cord segment is taken, and you hold it and untwist it and strip it to the baby within 20 seconds. And what happens in intact, that is after cutting, what happens in intact cord milking? So without even cutting, hold the cord very close to the placenta, and then you strip it towards the baby for 10 seconds, and then wait for 10 seconds for that to refill, and then do it 2 to 4 times. Okay, so this is intact cord milking, and so there are so many studies with that also. So let me quote our own study from St. John's, which was done in 2017 and 18, which was published in Resuscitation. There we wanted to look at umbilical cord milking on the short-term morbidity and hematological parameters at 6 weeks. So we had 60 neonates and umbilical cord milking versus immediate cord clamp in those babies who require resuscitation. This is in preterm babies. So look at the primary outcome of hematological parameters at 6 weeks. This hemoglobin level is definitely better in the cord milking group, and even serum ferritin was better at 6 weeks of postnatal age, which was statistically significant. Also, look at the secondary outcome. The hematocrit at 6 to 24 hours was better. Mean arterial pressure at 6 and 24 hours was better with the umbilical cord milking group, and the babies who had umbilical cord milking had less transfusion within 28 days of life. So umbilical cord milking, the placental transfusion strategy in preterm neonates requiring resuscitation with no significant adverse effect was the conclusion from our study. So how did we do umbilical cord? So it is, let me just show this umbilical cord milking, which we did it. Okay, so this was a study by done by Ram. Ram demonstrated during his demonstration to the nurses. So how do we do the intact umbilical cord milking? That I've already discussed. But what is important for you all to say is that milking the cord 4 times provides a similar amount of placental fetal blood as compared to the delayed cord clamp for 30 seconds. This is the most important point I want to stress. And there is one more recent study in 2019 which discussed umbilical cord milking linked to brain hemorrhage in preterm babies. In those babies who are at 23 to 27 weeks of gestation, which was a multicentric study which involved 1,500 babies, but the study was stopped in between because of the disadvantages and the complications, where they noted severe intraventricular hemorrhage in 8% versus 3%. 8% is in the umbilical cord milking group and 3% in the delayed cord clamp. And also in those babies, 23 to 27 weeks, they noted a high percentage of severe intraventricular hemorrhage. This is the latest 2019, the studies on umbilical cord. This is 2012 and 2013 and 15. So they all say this is umbilical cord milking versus the immediate cord care. So it says that the hematocrit at 36 to 48 hours was higher. Then 2013 also, the hemoglobin and serum ferritin at 6 weeks postnatal age was significantly higher in umbilical cord milking as compared to immediate cord clamping. So definitely the cord milking is better than immediate cord care. Now, umbilical cord milking versus delayed cord clamp also, which showed the comparable difference in mean serum ferritin and hemoglobin at 6 weeks of life. In 2015, 16 and 18 also said the hemoglobin and serum ferritin even at 6 months was better. The hemoglobin was better when you compare with those mothers who are anemic and those mothers who are not anemic. And kids, this is 9.6 gram as compared to 9.07. And even, the umbilical cord milking was definitely even at 6 weeks also, the significantly higher in the delayed cord milking, in umbilical cord milking groups. So in 2000, even at 12 months of age, umbilical cord milking group maintained the serum ferritin at a higher level. This is an important point that I want to stress on. Then 2018, and feasible and safety of umbilical cord milking, of course, there is no delay in resuscitation, no significant difference in resuscitation and resuscitation efforts and short-term outcomes between the two groups. So Of course, there is little jaundice, but it is not so significant, requiring extended transfusion, and it might require phototherapy, which is not very significant. But what prevent recommending, with all this evidence, still what prevent recommending umbilical cord milking as a routine procedure? Because there are variations in the evaluated outcomes. There are limited number of patients enrolled in those studies, and some of them had retrospective studies as well. So to summarize that, in term babies, summary of umbilical cord milking, of course, it improves the blood pressure, it improves iron storage at 6 months, which included so many trials, and improves the blood pressure, improves the urine output, cerebral oxygenation, reduces IVH of all grades, decreases chronic lung disease, decreases circulating cytokines, and decrease the need of transfusions, and even at 6 weeks, increase ferritin levels. And one more, 2019, the last, the meta-analysis published on umbilical cord milking versus delayed cord clamp, a systematic review in 2019. So the summary of the findings. So you can just look at this umbilical cord milking versus delayed cord clamp in the initial hematocrit, need of transfusions, MEIVH or hemoglobin levels at birth, and maximum serum bilirubin, and developmental quotient at 2 years, BSID. So all of them has low quality evidence. So low quality evidence, so their confidence in the effect estimate is limited. The true effect may be substantially different from the estimate of the effect. This is the conclusion from that study. So all of this have a low recommendation. Recommendation grade is low. So to conclude, umbilical cord milking wasn't reduced in hospital mortality and need for transfusion compared to delayed cord clamp, but lower the risk of IVH and improve certain neurodevelopmental outcome compared to delayed cord clamp in preterm infants. This is the conclusion from that study. So after knowing the evidence of delayed cord clamp and the effects of immediate cord clamp, the importance of placental transfusion, and the difference between the umbilical cord milking and the delayed cord clamp. So by knowing all this, my suggestions, so it is not the recommendation, it is my suggestion that we all know, it can be a summary as well. The premature and term newborns requiring resuscitation, we all know they need placental transfusion intact. From the placenta to the baby, it is very, very important in hypoxia babies who need resuscitation. So resuscitation with intact cord, it is good, it is effective, but there are a lot of logistic challenges there, violating the sterile field for the resuscitation of the baby. And we know anemia due to iron deficiency is a male health problem, especially in our country. And umbilical cord milking is safe, is feasible. Of course, it takes only less than 20 seconds, and it is much less time as compared to immediate cord clamp as well. It is inexpensive, and to prevent neonatal iron deficiency anemia. So also after 2015 recommendation, there are many more studies. 2018-19 studies are there. So umbilical cord milking is a simple procedure. It can be performed by obstetrical staff, but with no long learning curve. They can learn very easily. It doesn't require so much of time. In the context of neonatal asphyxia, given the very, very important, crucial importance of time in such situations. And standardized procedure is needed, but the standardized procedure is not there. Some of them have taken 20 centimeter long umbilical cord. Some of them have taken 20 centimeter umbilical cord. Some of them have intact umbilical cord. Some of them have done studies with a cut umbilical cord. We do not have the standardized procedures for umbilical cord milking. So if that has been standardized, there is no problem in following umbilical cord milking, in my view. So if there are no any questions, and thank you so much for your patience hearing. If there's any question, I'm happy to take.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So now over to Sidhu. Dinakar sir, are you there? There are few questions which has come from Facebook as well. That I request Dr. Dinakar sir to ask. Dr. Sidhu?
Yeah, I'll start, Prashant. Yeah. Good evening, ma'am. Sidhu here. Good evening, Janki ma'am and Chandrakala ma'am.
Yeah, good evening, Sidhu.
I hope you are doing fine, ma'am.
All well.
Ma'am, first, we'll start questions with Dr. Janki ma'am initially. Ma'am, is it necessary or mandatory to do RT-PCR for all pregnant women visiting labor room?
I think I mentioned it very clearly in my talk.
Yes, ma'am.
Not all women visiting. Very detailed history is very important here. If she has come from a hotspot, number one. If
Yes,
there
ma'am.
is a family history of contact with a coronavirus patient. And number three, if the lady is symptomatic. For example, she has walked in with high fever, respiratory problems. If she has wheezing, respiratory distress, it's assumed to be COVID unless proved otherwise. A detailed history is very, very important. If she comes from a very low risk area and she has had no contact, she is asymptomatic, it's not necessary to do a RT-PCR on everybody.
Right, ma'am. And next question is need of isolation of neonates born to pregnant women with suspected COVID, ma'am, where the report is awaited.
Yes. Again, a very good question. I think I answered it before.
Yes, ma'am.
RT-PCR, after all, takes only about 6 to 8 hours. In our hospital, it takes about 8 hours.
Yes, ma'am.
And the most ideal, see, this would depend upon the facility, Dr. Sidhu. The most ideal thing would be to definitely isolate this baby. May not be in the NICU, maybe in a special ward with a caretaker, for example, the grandmother or a caretaker.
Ma'am, this question was asked by one of my friends from North Karnataka, ma'am, especially. What his problem was, it takes around 48 hours here for the report to come, ma'am.
Yes, yes.
And it is a government setup where they are not in a position to isolate the child. Then he was very particular with me, why don't you ask this question?
Yes, I think in that facility, it's a very relevant question, Dr. Sidhu. What he can do is, if it's going to take 48 hours, all the more reason why we should isolate the baby. May not be in the NICU, but can be in the special ward with a caretaker. If the baby becomes symptomatic earlier, generally it is said that these babies become symptomatic at 36, 48 hours. It's again a very good question because most of these COVID positive neonates do not become positive in the first 24 hours.
Yes,
if first 24 hours they develop respiratory distress, it is due to some other problem. Like for example, a meconium aspiration or an RDS or a TTN. So in the first 24 hours, if things go bad, it's unlikely to be COVID. Whereas COVID symptomatology generally starts at 36, 48 hours. So it would be good to keep this baby in a separate room, isolation room, and send an RT-PCR at 24 hours of age. We never send RT-PCR immediately after birth. It's always sent at 24 hours and 48 hours.
24 hours.
And then, you take it from there. But if the baby gets symptomatic after 24 hours.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry?
There was a small confusion, ma'am. Recommendation from Foxy was at birth. One of the person from Bangalore has asked this. And American Academy of Pediatric recommends at 24 to 48 hours. What would you suggest, ma'am?
No. Most of the organizations have recommended at 24 hours. It is definitely not at birth. Most of the recommendations are at 24 hours of age. As I showed you that study from Wuhan, they had COVID positive mothers. The umbilical cord, blood, everything was studied at birth and everything was negative. It becomes positive only at 24, 48 hours. So you need to give that time. It's not at birth.
Dr. Sidhu, can you add some points?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Please continue.
We also have a protocol in place. It is based on the Foxy and NNF. So we send the RT-PCR of the baby only if the mother says come positive. So if the mother says positive, then we do for the baby. one. The second one, also the recommendation for isolating the baby from the mother whom awaiting the report. We do not, it is also based on, Dr. Janki has told already, it is facility based and the patient load based also. So we keep next to the mother. We keep next to the mother or maybe some few feet away from the mother, and for feeding she'll have to wear mask and hand wash. So if there is community transfusion, infection, then we have advised isolation. Otherwise, there is no isolation needed. And of course, Dr. Janaki said it is, facility.
Okay. Ma'am, Janki ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah, rectal swab or throat swab, ma'am? It is like a rapid fire round.
Definitely not a rectal swab. Number one option would be a nasopharyngeal swab. In a neonate, sometimes it's difficult to get a nasopharyngeal swab because of the very small nose. So we go for an oropharyngeal swab. Rectal swab by far has the least yield compared to nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal.
Okay. Suspected COVID positive mother, ma'am, and baby is sick. Should we go ahead with bag and mask or intubation?
Not necessary. You can do with bag and mask. That is probably the lesser of the two evils. You're likely to get more infected with intubation rather than bag and mask.
Okay. And one more question was, should we, what about the role of baby bath, ma'am, soon after birth?
No. Because of lack of time, I did not mention that. Baby bath is always recommended after when the baby is getting ready for discharge. Definitely not at 24 hours or less than 24 hours.
Okay. There was a little confusion about the vertical transfusion, ma'am. What do you think, ma'am? It's a no, or it's like some studies say yes, some studies say no?
I think my very good friend Archana posed that question. I did see it in the chat box.
That is what I wanted to come to that.
Yes. Thanks, Archana, for that question. It's a very relevant question. What I forgot to mention is that the baby is held by a health worker who has not handled the delivery herself. You remember, there is a nurse who is hanging around there just overseeing the whole thing. She probably holds the baby. The obstetrician does not hold the baby. Very relevant question, because we don't want, transmission from the health worker's hands. So it's a totally different person who holds the baby whilst DCC is being done.
Okay, I think most of the people were saying that there is no vertical transmission as such. I'll come back to you, ma'am. Now I'll move to Chandrakala, ma'am. Ma'am, is there any contraindication for delayed cord clamping?
Yeah, so twins, and of course, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You are audible, ma'am.
If it is multiple gestation and if there's any cord prolapse, or if IUGR babies or STA babies, there is a contraindication for delayed cord clamp.
Can we do umbilical cord milking in such scenarios, ma'am?
No, because already there is in IUGR babies, because of they already have increase in the hemoglobin and hematocrit concentration. There is no point in, we don't want, already they have polycythemia, so there is no, which is not needed.
Right. And up to what gestational age umbilical cord milking is not indicated, ma'am? You told a study where there is 23 to 27 weeks, it was not successful because the rate of IVH was high, around 8%. Can we do after 27 weeks, ma'am?
Yeah, actually we do, but according to ILCA 2015 guidelines, it is, they said less than 29 weeks. It is not indicated. It is not do unless it is a steady setting. So, but we have done in a preterm baby, those babies who require resuscitation, we have done in our center. So in 2000, it was published resuscitation. So we have done. So this is mainly for in ERBW babies because of the risk of IVH and rapid changes in the
perfusion pressure. Right now. Ma'am, regarding the one postgraduate has asked, delayed cord clamping is for 1 to 3 minutes. Why there is a range? Why there is not specific number?
Because no, definitely more than 30 seconds. Of course, our recommendation of NRP recommendation is at 1 minute. I already shared one slide. So it, if you delay the cord at 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, the placental, the transfusion also changes. The more you delay, the more blood goes to the baby.
baby.
You don't want the baby to become polycythemic if you delay clamping for more than 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So
Is there anything like it's for one is for preterm, other one is for term?
what?
Is there like 1 minute is for a term child and 3 minutes is for a preterm child? That is not the point.
No, it is mainly based on how much of blood is transfused at that particular time. So at that particular seconds of clamping.
Okay. Ma'am, is there any Indian study asked by Len, resuscitation with intact placental cord, ma'am?
No, there is I didn't find any of the that is the latest. I didn't find any Indian studies.
Studies.
Yeah.
Okay. Does gravity play a role in delayed cord clamping?
Yes. Yes, if they recommend if the baby is kept below the introitus, so definitely there is a lot of blood coming to the baby. So gravity definitely play a role in having more blood transfused to the baby from the placenta.
Okay. I think you had a slide on placental transfusion. Again, if we have got a question on that, ma'am. What is the role of placental transfusion in normal delivery versus C-section?
In C-section, role of placental so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as long as the timing of the cord was maintained. It doesn't matter. So even it is cesarean or normal delivery, if you have some time for clamping, definitely more blood goes to the baby.
Okay. Actually, cord milking and delayed cord clamping as a factor of neonatal hyperbilirubinemia, especially in Rh negative mother.
Yes. So there is.
What do you say?
But in this mother, it is not so high to require any phototherapy or exchange transfusion.
Okay. Ma'am, there is one case scenario which they have asked. In severe IUGR babies where the weight is less than 3rd percentile and antenatal Doppler suggestive of reverse flow, can we do delayed cord clamping in such babies?
So as I told you, these group of IUGR babies will have, because of the chronic hypoxia in utero, they have hypothermia.
Okay.
So there is, I don't think that we need delayed cord clamping.
Okay.
So that
okay.
is
If
delayed cord clamping.
If the baby is limp and apneic in such scenario, can we do umbilical cord milking?
Which group of babies you're talking about? In SGA babies you're talking about? Or
yes, ma'am. In IUGR babies.
No, IUGR babies, there is no. So they immediately cord clamp because already they have hypoxia, right?
Yes, ma'am.
They have more blood volume. They are more prone to have polycythemia. So no delayed cord. Baby has already asphyxia. So it's not indicated.
Okay. Dr. Dinakar sir, you want to add anything on this?
No. Everything answered. Very nice. Excellent. How vertical transmission is not possible? Everybody asked, madam and everybody. Vertical transmission is not at all. There is no chance at all because ACE2 inhibitor is maximum. It is there in the lungs. ACE2 inhibitor. Other ACE2 inhibitors are there on the placenta, uterus, but that is other receptors of ACE2 that cannot attach the COVID virus. So when from the lungs, it cannot come to the blood at all. How it will come to the baby? So it is not possible. ACE2 inhibitor receptor is there only in the lungs and the throat. Nowhere other than that, what COVID virus attaches, it is nowhere in the body.
Okay.
The other types of ACE2 are there in other body. It is not useful. So vertical transmission chances is not there because of this reason. That is a very good question and made everybody answer. And even if there is a contraindication for DCC, very good, excellent answer has come from Dr. Chandrakala. Very good, because it is a abruptio placenta. At the same time, Doppler study is abnormal, baby is limp. Can we do? And baby is avulsion of the cord. She has answered very good, excellent. Is there any condition we can do umbilical cord milking? Yes, you can do if the baby is limp. Immediately we want to take. One more thing, Dr. Chandrakala, in your video, you have showed.
Yeah.
Dr. Chandrakala?
Yes, I'm here. Tell me.
Everybody is there. You have showed cut umbilical cord milking. Number one. So you told 25 centimeters should be there, umbilical cord minimum. You should do 2 times or 4 times milking, you told. Suppose intact umbilical cord if the baby is limp. So intact umbilical cord baby is linked and umbilical cord milking, that time 4 times you have to do in a 20 seconds. Each time is 5 seconds. 5 seconds. That is more than enough. In intact umbilical cord from the placenta to the baby. You are showing cut umbilical cord. But how to remember is 20 centimeter, 20 seconds, 4 times. Okay, that is also excellent one. Then one more thing Sidhu was asked, which gestational age we should not do UCM, means umbilical cord. That you told 29 weeks, that everybody knows 29 weeks. Because why I am summarizing this is excellent answer, very good. And you are the NRP teacher, both are NRP teachers, both are masters. Can you people start teaching instead of cutting the card? Because you people are doing ABC, airway, breathing, circulation. Can you people start from today or this moment, ABC, airway, breathing and clamp, later clamp, because breathing will increase the circulation also from the umbilical cord. Can you people try it? ABC, because you people are telling cut the cord, take the baby. Why can't we do there only? Because in case if the baby needs more blood, at least we can push that. More volume needs after the chest compression. You are telling us to give the volume. Instead of that same, whatever the baby's blood is there in umbilical cord, we can push to the baby, it is more better. Why can't you suggest from tomorrow? Both legends, I am asking the question.
Yeah.
No, answer please.
Yeah, we will do. Yeah.
We will do. Thank you, Sidhu. Thank you, Prashant.
Sir, there is one more question.
Clarify whether cord milking or DCC has to be done in RH negative mother to be done or not in RH negative mother. So
I think you have answered that, ma'am.
intention is to have more blood to the baby. It is fine, right?
Yeah. Actually, one more question was there. Why in acute hypoxia there is decreased blood volume as blood is coming through the umbilical artery? I think anyone of you can take this one, ma'am.
Yeah. No. This is because when there is compression of the cord. When there is compression of the cord, I told already 2 arteries and 1 vein will be there. So one vein supplies blood from the placenta to the baby. So the artery, the blood baby to the placenta. As this is the main mode of nutrition to the baby in utero. When there is hypoxia, there is cord compression. 2 arteries veins are there. So umbilical vein, which is very thin walled and it is low pressure, it collapses first. That causes delay in the blood transferred from the placenta to the baby. While the flow through the umbilical artery is maintained because it is a high pressure and thick walled, it doesn't collapse for some time. So this is the answer.
Okay. Over to you, Prashant, if you have got any questions. Prashant.
I think most of the things are covered. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you all the participants. I'm sure if you have any queries and doubts,
Tomorrow, please announce.
yeah,
Tomorrow.
if you have any queries and doubts, you can watch the recorded video, which we'll be putting in Facebook in our National Neonatal Forum chapter. If you have any queries and doubts, you can post it there. We will try to answer it from our lecturer, our teachers. So tomorrow we are having a talk on COVID infants and pregnancy, their personal experience. Dr. Gautam Suresh, who is an advisor for Government of America for his region in Texas. So he's going to share his first-hand experience about how they have handled it, how they have managed, and how they are managing right now. So it's going to be a very interesting session. So I request all the participants to log in tomorrow and to be with us at the same time, same place, Zoom, between 5 to 6:30. Is there anything which you want to add, Dinakar sir?
No, sir. Very good. So once again, thanks from the NNF, Dr. Janki Madam, Dr. Chandrakala. Please, excellent topic. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Sidhu, for
Sir,
Great.
sir,
Thanks
I'm
for the
part of the group. You
opportunity.
need not thank me.
Thank you for the whole the organizing team. Thank you so much. For the,
Thank you,
It was a
Janki
pleasure
ma'am.
to be
Thank
here.
you, Chandrakala ma'am. It was nice talking to you guys after a long time, after Karnyokan, I guess.
yes.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Sidhu. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
thank you,
ma'am.
thank you. Okay.